at a very high level, I kind of grew up aware of Ralph as a Star Wars fan. I was 7 when Star Wars came out. And so through the portfolio of paintings that Valentine published in 77, one of the few products that was available right away, I immediately knew Ralph's name the way I knew, Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher.
Right.
And so was basically a fan from very early on.
Yeah.
And through a strange batch of circumstances, a good friend of mine ran a movie memorabilia shop and was hosting a convention. And one day I was in his store and he asked me if I knew who Ralph McQuarrie was. And I thought, well, of course I know who Ralph McQuarrie is. I'm a child of the 70s. And he asked me because I had worked at a bookstore and done a lot of signings. He said, well, I'm going to invite Ralph to be a guest at my convention. Would you mind sitting with him that afternoon and, helping out? And I thought, sit with Ralph McQuarrie for a few hours. It's like, yeah, I'll do that. I'd love to do that. Thinking that I'm going to have, this amazing experience that, to sit with somebody I've admired, all my life. Thought that'd be great. So we did this event. We sent a limo up to pick up Ralph. He lived in Berkeley, California. And limousines were not Ralph's things. He was a very down-to-earth guy, very humble. Yeah. I think he would have been more comfortable sitting up front with the driver, frankly, than back in the back of the limousine. But he came to the show and he met fans, and I got to kind of talk with him as, I kind of helped coordinate the line and the signing, and just had a wonderful time. He was a wonderful, sweet guy, just very generous with his time, very interested in everyone that came up and wanted to meet him. And at the end of the event, I thought, wow, what a great day. I'm going to remember this always. And Ralph turned to my friend Stan and I and said, that was fun. If you ever want to do it again, just give me a call. So our minds immediately started thinking, it's like, well, we've got to do this. And over the next several years, we took Ralph across the country. We took him to Europe to meet fans and to get an opportunity not only to, see some of the public that, he kind of was aware that he had fans. People would write to him, but I don't think he realized quite the impact he had, because when you're sitting at a table and someone comes up to you and says, I'm doing what I'm doing today. I'm an artist today. I'm a model maker today. I'm doing something because of what you did. What you did inspired me. If you hear that once or twice, maybe you can brush it off and say, well, that's a fluke. But when, person after person does that, it starts to sink in, and you can't deny that, you've had this impact. So we did that for a number of years, had a great time, really, kind of became family with Ralph, which was the real blessing for us. And one of the interesting things is we'd go visit him, a couple times a month. We'd go up to his house, we'd have lunch, just, hang out and spend time with him. And usually at some point during the day, we'd kind of descend down into his office, and, he'd show us things he might be working on, or he'd open a drawer and pull out sketches that he had. And it was constantly this revelation of things he would pull out. I remember very specifically one afternoon, he pulled out a drawing and it was vaguely familiar. It's like, well, Ralph, what's that? And he said, oh, that's just the one piece I did for Raiders of the Lost Ark. And our eyes kind of got big and we thought, you worked on Raiders? And he's like, no, I just did this one thing. Well, it turns out in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ralph did the drawing that's in the Bible prop. So when they say, what does this ark look like? And they open the Bible and they, write splashed across the screen as this illustration. Well, Ralph had done that. And we were blown away because, that kind of trivia wasn't common. There weren't people talking about it. And It turned out there were a lot of things like that. We found out, we had known Ralph worked on Close Encounters, and we knew Ralph worked on Battlestar Galactica. But there were more and more things that would come up, and we'd realize, gosh, you've done a lot of things that the fan base isn't really aware of. And we were more and more inspired over time to get this into the public eye, to get people to know Ralph for more than just Star Wars, which was really, even now, that's what Ralph will always be remembered for, because he made such a monumental contribution to it. But there were so many other things he did, and so many other stories he had that hadn't been told. We said, Ralph, we want to do a book of your work. We want to publish a big, heavy coffee table book that will represent everything you did and not just Star Wars. And he kind of laughed and said, well, others have tried, and it's never really worked out, but you guys go, you're young, go for it. Whatever you want to do, I'm on board. And it turns out that others had gone down this path, had approached, had kind of deals in place. And usually where they would get hung up is they would contact Lucasfilm. And at the time, one particular publisher, a gentleman named Byron Price, who had used Ralph and had Ralph do some really beautiful illustrations for Isaac Asimov's short story collections. Mm-hmm. He approached Lucasfilm and basically was told, you can have 2 pages of the interior and nothing on the cover of Star Wars. Mm-hmm. And from his standpoint, it's like, how do you sum up Ralph's contributions to Star Wars in 2 pages? And really, that's the marketable aspect of the book. So it never happened. So undaunted, we pressed on. We had some friends working at Lucasfilm that we knew, and we basically built a mock-up of the book we wanted to do, and got our foot in the door and made a pitch. Right. And rather cavalierly made the pitch that what we were going to do is a 2-volume set. And first we were going to do a book of Ralph's non-Star Wars work to prove that we were capable of this. And then that would, prove to Lucasfilm that we were legitimate, and they could then allow us to do a Star Wars volume. And they patted us on the head and said, that's nice, but leave us your sample. We've got some changes happening in publishing, and we'll get back to you. And about 2 weeks later, we got a call saying, we talked about it. Everybody's kind of excited. The one thing they agree is it needs to be 1 volume, and it needs to have Star Wars. So what do you need from us? Wow. And we were kind of slack-jawed. It's like, well, we need access to the archives of what you have. Yeah. They said, okay. We thought, all right. They said, well, how much are you thinking this would be? And so I immediately kind of, in my head, I'm doing calculations. I said, we want to do a 400-page book, a third of it Star Wars. And they said, okay. And then we were kind of in shock, like, all right. And the next thing I know, we've got access into their digital archives at the level of their highest licensees. And we're suddenly, going through files and pointing out things that, hey, you've got this marked as Ralph's and it's not his, or you've got this other thing unidentified and it is Ralph's. So we were able to kind of add some value to the process, but basically went through pulling artwork. I'll never forget one day in talking to Ralph about what he wanted to see in there. He had mentioned, he's like, well, there's this one painting I really loved. It's probably my favorite Star Wars painting. We said, well, that's got to be in there. What is it? He said, it's one of the pieces I did for the Star Wars Holiday Special, which is the notorious, aired once and never seen again, except for the bootleg copies that circulate about the Wookiee homeworld. But we thought, well, again, if it's Ralph's favorite piece, that's going in this book. And we approached our contacts in licensing, and we said, hey, we don't see this, but Ralph, this is Ralph's favorite piece. We want it in. And they said, well, anything having to do with the holiday special, that's got to go across George's desk. And we thought, well, they've never said no to us yet. So we said, okay, ask George. And a week later, we get a call saying, George said, okay. And it's like, yeah, because George loved Ralph. George, knew what a valuable contributor Ralph was. And I think they also were clear that what we were trying to do was honor Ralph. We weren't just trying to, get our piece of Star Wars and, have a product that we could say is a Star Wars product. We were doing a Ralph McQuarrie book. And it was constantly like that, the entire relationship. I've been involved in several licensing projects with a lot of major licensees. And if I listed all the names, anyone would point to Lucasfilm and say they were probably the hardest to work with. And the absolute opposite is true. They didn't ask anything of us. They didn't ask to review what we were doing. They basically just, every time we asked for something, they handed it over. They invited us over one day. They said, we're about to ship 10,000 35 millimeter slides back to ILM. Before we do, would you like to go through them?
Wow.
Again, it's like, yes, what time should we be there? And in the process of this, we found photographs of Ralph working. We found photographs of Ralph's paintings that Ken Ralston and Joe Johnston and Dennis Murin had taken pictures of. They just basically set them up and take a picture with a 35 millimeter camera. And it turns out there were slides of Ralph's paintings that had changed, meaning as the designs changed, oftentimes Ralph would just repaint over the original version. So we were fine. I found a particular slide of an image that had never been really seen before, because the finished painting is very common and had been widely published, but this particular variation no one really knew existed. So I was thrilled, and we ordered up this particular slide. And that was a case where, when they uploaded the new digital images, I was really excited, and I went through them and I thought, wait, there's a missing one. There's supposed to be one of this, it's the TIE fighter cockpit. And the people in the archive said, oh, no, we didn't scan that one because we already have it. And I'm like, you don't already have it. I said, it's actually different than the one you have. But they went back and they scanned it, and we were able to get it and use it. But again, these little bits of history that, to the untrained eye, you'd never notice. But we were having a blast. We were just, every turn, every corner, there were new discoveries being made. And we went through this process. We're literally at the point of the book is done. We're about to send it off to the printer. I'm about to write the biggest check I've ever written in my life, assuming that people will be as interested in this book as I was, and as my partner Stan was. And we contact Lucasfilm. I said, okay, what I really need to know now, I said, is how much the licensing fee is going to be. I said, because whatever it is, we're going to have to pay it. But I need to know before we, set the price, figure all these things out. And they kind of dragged their feet. And I thought, oh, I'm terrified at not knowing what this is going to be.
Yeah.
And got a letter from legal saying the license is granted for the promotional consideration this offers. And again, that's George Lucas respecting Ralph McQuarrie in the grandest fashion. We were able to release our book, and as a result, I can proudly say that we paid Ralph more in royalties for the book than George paid him to paint the original paintings for Star Wars. But all that aside, the most significant part of this process for us is when we got the first copies of the book back from the printer, and we took them up to Ralph and his wife's house in Berkeley, and we laid them out on a table. And Ralph, came downstairs and started flipping through it. And suddenly in his eyes, it dawned on me that throughout this almost 2-year process, that he never really believed that it was going to happen. He was sure that at some point the floor would fall out from under us, and it just wouldn't be. And so seeing him holding the book and flipping through it, he gave himself the highest compliment I ever heard in the 16 years that I knew him. And he did that by saying, some of this isn't too bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Ralph, there are a lot of people that wish they could do as not too bad as you do on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But that day we were beaming. When we left Ralph's, it was not a question of, is this book going to sell enough copies to make the cost back? It was like, it didn't matter. We had the book we wanted, and Ralph had the book while he was there to see it and hold it and appreciate it and know that it was going to be there long after all of us were gone. And that was a great moment of pride for us. But again, just that recognition of knowing that at the time that he was honestly surprised to see it realized, was a great thing that made the whole experience worthwhile. And then, from that point on, and even, past the point of Ralph's passing in 2012, I've kind of seen myself in the role of an evangelist for Ralph McQuarrie, to continue to do what I can to make sure that Ralph is not only known and recognized for what he did for Star Wars, but for all the other films he worked on and all the other projects he worked on, because he was so versatile. And some of that comes across in the imagery that people are familiar with, but just in that he worked on movie posters, and he worked on book covers, and he worked on film and television and video games and amusement park attractions. He affected us in so many ways, that the last time I saw Ralph, I said to him, I said, I don't know what I did, Ralph, to get the honor of knowing you in my life. I said, but I'm going to be repaying that debt for a long, long time. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here today, is to continue to share Ralph's stories that I was able to hear firsthand, and again continue to evangelize his artwork and his contributions to these films, these properties that we all love so much.
Well, I have to tell you, which I'm sure you've been told before, that the way you have told his story in the last 22 minutes to me, it felt as if you were talking about, not in a vanity way, about your own life story. Like, you were just so, I mean, I can tell it was a big part of your life, and it still is, right?
Yeah.
The amount of passion you have, and it's rare, because people, I mean, even for your own family member, you don't have that kind of a passion and dedication of someone's work, but the fact that you're so involved in it, I think if he's listening from above, he would be glad that he met you as well. So, I really enjoyed listening to the way you even put this story together. And as you were talking, I was thinking in my head, as a filmmaker, why I wish you guys had documented all this journey, getting the book published, like, because that itself was like, a film to be made about what you guys went through, the struggle. So bravo, good stuff. Really
Thank you. Yeah, and really, just to speak about Ralph the man for a moment, one of the things that made Ralph so amazing is that someone that talented has every right to have the biggest ego on the planet. And I think we all know those people whose ego and talent are aligned. We also know the people whose ego and talent aren't aligned. But for someone of Ralph's caliber to be so self-deprecating and so humble, it was, again, just amazing to see that, a 15-year-old kid would come up to him at a convention and say, can I show you my portfolio, my drawings? And Ralph would take a sincere interest, and they'd show them what they did, and he'd offer feedback, and he'd say, well, depending on what you want to do, you render things really well, or you can, you do likenesses really well. But if you want to be a concept designer, what you want to do is show people the process, show them your sketches, not just, kind of finished, polished work, but your thought process. Or he'd say, don't, he said every artist will have that period of their life where you're kind of mimicking the styles of the people you like. He said, but find you. He said, what you have to offer is equally valid to your ability to, mimic somebody else's style. And he said, and again, it was just the kind of the heart of who he was, and being interested in helping other people kind of develop their skills or become successful. His road to doing what he did was very unique. He didn't set out to work in films or to work on the types of projects that he did, but it was very much a path of one thing leading to another. He started off in industrial design and working at Boeing because he loved airplanes.
Right.
But as he told us, he didn't love drawing, the rows of windows on a 747. That wasn't where his passion was.
Yeah.
But through his work at Boeing, he did design work promoting the supersonic transport that Boeing was working on. And during that process, he met some young filmmakers, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, who later, when Ralph moved to LA, they were working on a script for a science fiction property, and they said, well, Ralph, you had done those paintings we all loved for the supersonic, jet. Could you do some paintings that we might be able to help us sell our film? And he said, sure. So he got their script and he read it. He came up with some paintings, and doing those 5-6 paintings for them was, as he described it, the first time he really felt like he was in his element, like he was doing what he was supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And the film never got made. It never went anywhere. But through some stroke of fate, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins were film school buddies with a guy named George Lucas. George saw the paintings when they went to, I think, pick them up at one time from Ralph's little apartment in Los Angeles. And he told Ralph, I've got this idea for kind of an epic galactic war. Maybe someday I'll, reach out to you. And Ralph thought, okay, didn't think any more of it. George goes on to make American Graffiti. A little while later, he gets a call. Gary Kurtz and George want to come by. January 31st, 1975, they drop off the script. Ralph opens it up, immediately starts sketching, does little illustrations. Before February's over, he's already created his first paintings for Star Wars that define what we now know as Darth Vader and R2-D2 and C-3PO. And again, it's these connections of, because he happened to, when he was working at Boeing, he ran into these other guys and they were friends with George. So many other things could have happened where that connection never gets made. A case could be made that Star Wars never gets made, or Star Wars gets made and it's very different because it's lacking that thumbprint of Ralph McQuarrie that is so pivotal to what we now, think of as the Star Wars look and feel. And again, Ralph was now thrust into this reality where not only was he working on this project that in time became this huge success, but the paintings that he did so that the crew and the other filmmakers would get a sense of what George was trying to do were now being reproduced. They were showing up in magazines. And as an artist, if you think about it, there's an element where you're a little bit, gosh, well, if I knew they were going to be that widespread, I might have worked a little bit harder. I might have tried to do a better job.
Yeah.
And again, it's just the fact that those original paintings can work, as licensed artwork, is a testament to the quality of an artist that Ralph was.
Yeah, and what and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm pretty sure things like that existed before, but one of the things that Star Wars did, and obviously Ralph's work, is that films like Raiders or Minority Report, Jurassic Park, Back to the Future, there's so much concept work. Like, for example, one of the books that Cassine worked on, he's worked on several, like Back to the Future, E.T., and other books similar to it, those books that are by the same publisher. They just have so much concept art in it, right? Like the ones that we never see, the ones we have never seen. And I find that a lot of it has to do with the fact that Star Wars started this trend at a mainstream level, and Ralph's work. Because there's just so much stuff out there of so many films, even, the most recent films like Avatar, for example. You wouldn't have that idea of drawing something, painting something, and that, it's always difficult, even as a director, for you to have that visual sense. And sometimes somebody like Ralph comes along and draws it for you, and you're like, that eureka moment.
Yeah.
So am I right in that assumption that he pretty much started that trend at the mainstream level?
He was certainly one of the most influential. There's an artist named Bill Stout who had done a lot of concept work, and when I met him and we were talking about Ralph, he described it in a way that I had never really thought about before. But he said, filmmakers like George Lucas and Dan O'Bannon and Ridley Scott, kind of all Star Wars in that same era, were going to artists. So in the case of George, they went to Ralph. In the case of Dan O'Bannon, when he was first working on Dune, he went to H.R. Giger, and he went to Mobius, and he went to Ron Cobb. And then when Dune didn't happen as a movie, most of those guys transitioned over to Alien.
Yeah.
And Bill Stout described it as, if you were a working artist, you couldn't break into Hollywood. You couldn't crack that closed system because you weren't coming out of the family history or the studio system where you would have had a leg into the industry. But suddenly these young filmmakers were stepping outside the boundaries and picking artists based on liking their styles, seeing Frazetta and saying, that's what I'm going for. Yeah. So rather than saying I'm going to go to a studio assigned artist and ask them to do something for me, I'm going to go to an artist that I admire, that I appreciate, and have them do the work for me. And so for someone like Bill Stout, now there was an opportunity for someone like him to get into films and work on things like Conan and Return of the Living Dead. And so, Ralph was there on the ground floor, but really the credit goes to those filmmakers that sought out artists that were outside that kind of Hollywood system, and gave them an opportunity. And then it kind of defined this new role of a concept designer. Whereas previously you'd have, set decorators, production designers, you'd have people that would have the responsibilities. But particularly for a film like Star Wars, where basically everything needed to be defined. And again, one of the very unique things about Ralph is that here was someone who was basically doing set design, world building, creating kind of the look of the locations. He could do the mechanicals, the machinery, the ships, the weaponry, the costumes. It's like all these different pieces where even today, you'll have separate artists kind of responsible for each of those things. To have one artist who is able to kind of fluently kind of create in all those arenas and then render a finished painting that would exploit them all. One of the reasons why, people often talk about Ralph's paintings is it's not just like a mechanical drawing to say, oh yeah, I get what that, spaceship is going to look like, but he puts it in a frame. he puts it in something where you're like, I'm seeing the finished film in this one piece of art. And almost always it's so engaging that you're like, you see that piece of art and you want to see the film that comes from that, or that, that you would think of that representing, whereas the art, is kind of defining what that look is going to be.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I was talking to Mark Mancina. He's a composer. I don't know if you know his work from Twister, Speed, and Bad Boys.
Sure.
Yeah. And we were talking about something similar, that, how there are soundtracks that you can listen to on their own without ever having to watch the film, right? Like they just live independently on their own. I think that's similar to really great concept work or artwork or painting like Ralph's, is that you don't need to see the film.
Yes.
Obviously it would be good to, but some work just translates so much storytelling with just one visual or two visual, like the design of Darth Vader, right? Like, it speaks. I mean, to this day, who doesn't know about Darth Vader, right? It's been done in so many movie and TV shows and made fun of, or done a parody of.
He was on the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah. And there hasn't been anything like it, right? And to be able to draw that and leave it's become such an iconic cultural phenomenon, not just in North America, but all over the world. And that's what I think is a testament to his work, that by itself, if I was to, or that 30 years from now or 100 years from now, if Star Wars DVDs or movies disappeared for some reason and there was some artwork left, they'll be able to do something with it, or they'll be able to identify that there's a story behind this.
Yeah, it's funny because Ralph, he went through a period in his life where he thought, I've been doing these, projects and movies and different things. He's like, maybe I should do something. Maybe I should be an artist. Maybe I should be a fine artist. Maybe I should do something that, holds up on its own rather than, being someone else's kind of concept.
Yeah.
And he did some pieces of, like, he painted rocks, and he did a lot of, a lot of his things were surrealistic and just beautiful. But it was so funny to us. We think, we look at it, and we're like, Ralph, any one of your pieces can be considered fine art. And I understand where he was coming from and why he kind of felt that desire, but that wasn't really where his passion lied, but he also liked to work with his hands. He built furniture and he built clocks, and he would, he would paint, he'd do ornamental painting of them, and they're just beautiful things. He'd scratch build airplanes because airplanes were something he loved. And, there were times, he developed Parkinson's late in life, and that unfortunately robbed him of some number of years of being able to do more painting, but also, again, I think more of the work with his hands, the woodworking things. That we regret those lost years, but we certainly cherish everything we did get from him.
Yeah. I think you're right about him wanting to do something on his own, because even though, he has a large fan base, right? But an average moviegoer probably doesn't know who he is, right? That's just the reality of things. So to be able to associate, when people talk about Star Wars, they talk about Darth Vader, they talk about George Lucas, they talk about Luke Skywalker, or Han Solo, or Princess Leia, or John Williams, but they don't talk about the back end work, like whether it's ILM special effects, whether it's Ralph's work. And I think he probably wanted to be associated with something that was just his own, not for vanity, but just, that it's his, and people remember that work and they only refer to him about it, which is perfectly fine. And I think as human beings, we all crave that.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things he was quick to point out is that, unlike so many artists, and unlike so many artists who even kind of work in the field, Star Wars actually did bring him some notoriety, some fame, where many other artists in the same position would never have.
Of course.
And he recognized that, the fact that his work was reproduced in books, before ours, they did the Art of Star Wars. And again, for the portfolios for kids like me growing up, that was how we came to know him. And he really respected the fact that, unlike so many artists that had come before him, not only was there the artwork, was kind of reproduced and would exist for the ages, but there'd be little write-ups that might say, here's who I was and here's what I did. And again, respecting the fact that that's such a rare thing for someone in his position, for any artist to kind of get to that point where someone is publishing your work, writing about who you were, even at a smaller level. It's he used to say, he would have done the work on Star Wars for nothing, just for the experience and how much fun he had with it. And that speaks volumes.
Yeah. And do you think, do you know if he was ever interacting or if he knew Drew Struzan?
I'm trying to think if,
I mean, they both come from the same time.
Yeah, I honestly don't know if they met. He knew Sid Mead. Sid Mead had gone to Art Center, and it's funny because, Ralph used to talk about when he was at Art Center, it was Sid Mead's work that would be up on the walls that everybody would look at and say, oh, that's the guy. That's the superstar. Didn't matter who else they were. He was the one they all looked up to. But I honestly don't recall if he ever actually met Drew. He knew who Drew was. He was familiar with his work because, he certainly had an appreciation for other artists kind of working in and around this arena. And Ralph was not a big social person. In the Star Wars days, he was in his 40s when, most the rest of the cast and crew were in their 20s. And he was working out of his apartment. So, he'd come into ILM and, bring paintings in or to meet with George. But he was kind of removed, socially. He had a lot of those folks are friends. And we have, through the years, we'd recorded some interviews with Ralph, and we did a lot of work interviewing a lot of the people he worked with. And it's amazing that, to a person, everybody just talks about how much they loved Ralph and what a wonderful person he was. And the funny thing is, you'd call somebody up and say, hey, can we come talk to you about Ralph McQuarrie? Everybody would make time in their schedule. No one would say, no, I don't have time. I'm not interested. It's like, Ralph, yes. And it's funny because the Lauren Petersons, the Dennis Murins, the John Bergs, Phil Tippett's, all those guys, that got to know Ralph, not only during Star Wars, but after they moved up north, because that's, after coming back from London, working on Empire Strikes Back, is when Ralph moved to Berkeley. And so he was just across the bay from ILM. And so oftentimes over, and everybody knew him and loved him. And again, continued to sing his praises to this day.
That's such a great way of being remembered while you're living too. That your name. Normally, people who are very extrovert, they attract other people more than introverts. And from what you're telling me, he was an introvert, or at least not much of a social person. And to be able to pull audiences, not just because of his work, but also his personality, that's a testament to who he was. And I think people probably, I can tell by talking to you, you remember him more for him being the human being that he was. Obviously the work too, but that's phenomenal. What was some of the stuff that he wanted to work on and he couldn't for what, whether he got sick at the end or whether it was a conflict in terms of the project that he was working on?
Well, there are some things that he worked on that just didn't happen. There's a particular project he worked on with Irvin Kershner. Post Empire Strikes Back, Irvin Kershner was trying to mount a remake of Forbidden Planet. And Ralph did a ton of paintings for that. Stan Winston was involved. A lot of people were involved, but it's one of those cases where the artwork exists. Thankfully, we included that in a book we did that came out in 2015. So it was after Ralph passed away. It was one of those things we thought, oh, we've got to get this artwork into the world. People, it can't just, forever be locked in a drawer unseen. But that was a project, you could tell when you kind of went through Ralph's body of work, the projects that he responded to. Another example was Cocoon.
Oh, right.
Cocoon,
that was the Ron Howard movie, right?
Well, originally it was a Bob Zemeckis. So he was working on it with Bob Zemeckis, and then the studio was concerned about Romancing the Stone. They thought it was going to be a flop. So they fired Robert Zemeckis. Of course, we all know. So whatever happened to Robert Zemeckis, right? But then Ron Howard picked it up, and Ron Howard, finished the film. But Ralph was working. Ken Ralston was visual effects supervisor. Ralph did a lot of work directly with them, and Ralph did a ton of beautiful paintings for Cocoon. Lovely stuff. Some things that, really beautiful kind of underwater, kind of like city ruins, like Atlantis. And when it came time for Academy Award consideration, Ken Ralston included Ralph in the 5, I guess, names for the visual effects, and they won. And so Ralph actually won an Oscar for that film. And it's funny because I think, again, in Ralph's kind of self-deprecating way, he felt like, well, I think they kind of roped me in because Star Wars, they kind of wanted to recognize me. And it's like, Ralph, we've seen your Cocoon paintings. It's like and they rendered those things on screen beautifully. It's like you are very deserving of the honor that they bestowed upon you. So that was one. There was one project that around 97. It was the 20th anniversary of Star Wars.
Okay.
And one thing Ralph had worked on in the spring of 1977 is Gary Kurtz had him do some movie poster concepts. And so Ralph designed, a couple different ideas, that really kind of laid a lot of the foundation for the artwork that we saw in the classic Tom Jung one sheet for Star Wars, or the Hildebrandt brothers Star Wars, the big Darth Vader in the background and kind of Luke and Leia up front. And Ralph had done a movie poster comp for Star Wars, but he never did a finished painting on it because they went with other artists to do the final work. And as the 20th anniversary was rolling around, he thought, that might be kind of fun to do, to take, finish that painting that I started, or that I designed, but actually now do it as a finished painting. And he called up Lucasfilm, and it's one of those things. If he had called up George would have said, do it, Ralph, do it. But he called up the appropriate people in Lucasfilm, and someone said, oh, no, we've, Drew Struzan's doing the 20th anniversary one sheets. And Ralph said, well, no, I'm not, I know this wouldn't be the one sheet. I was thinking it would just be kind of, maybe a commemorative sort of thing. And they said, oh, no, we've got this other artist doing a commemorative thing. And Ralph got off the phone and thought, okay, and didn't do it. And I heard the story a little bit later, because had I known had I
Yeah,
known that Ralph he wanted to do it for him,
yeah.
but he wouldn't do it just for himself. But if they had said yes, he would have done it. And had I known, I would have told him, Ralph, do it for you. Um, and sadly, we never got Ralph's finished version of that painting. But in 2008, for the 30th anniversary of Star Wars in Japan, we did a Japanese translation of one of our books, and we asked a friend of ours who is a friend of Ralph's, a sculptor named Lawrence Noble, who had started off as an artist doing all kinds of licensed work and projects, but had gotten into sculpting. He's famous for the bronze Yoda that exists in front of all of the Lucasfilm facilities. But we had asked him, we said, Larry, would you be interested in taking Ralph's comp and doing it as a final painting? And he hadn't done, he had kind of moved away from painting to sculpting. But because he had known Ralph for years, and he thought, well, what a great way to kind of do a tribute to Ralph. And particularly now that Ralph was no longer able to do the painting. And so we had him do basically his version of Ralph's Star Wars one sheet that we offered this Japanese convention. So it was kind of a nice way to, it's not the same as having Ralph's version, but at least it kind of brought Ralph's vision to a wider audience.
It's interesting you mentioned Japanese, right? I've noticed that too when it comes to films done by Spielberg, whether they're produced or directed, or even Star Wars or anything, that because of possibly, I'm guessing, their culture of anime, and they really appreciate art to a level I don't even think Europeans or French do. Like it's just another level. Anytime like a film, like I don't know if you've seen AI, Artificial Intelligence, that came out 22 years ago by Steven Spielberg. There was a Japanese program book, like about, I don't know, 11 by 18, 10 pages, full colored. When the film came out, I really liked the film, and I just randomly bought something off eBay, Japanese AI book, and it was like $30. And then the film tanked at the box office, and when it came out on DVD, it's something, one of those things where the films do better on VHS and DVD. And I just kind of, just for the heck of it, I put that program book back up, the Japanese program book. I sold it for $800.
Holy smokes.
In 6 months' time. I mean, and somebody from Japan bought it because of they just appreciate art to another level. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you probably already know this. I think you probably have a bigger following with Ralph's work in Japan than anywhere else.
The funny thing is, we did, and particularly when we did our first book, the downside of having done a 400-page, 12 by 15, 12-pound hardcover book is you quickly find out, no matter what you charge for the book, if someone in Australia, Japan, Europe wants it, the shipping is more than the book itself. But to their credit, the fans in those areas, didn't hold back. They were supporting it as well. But yeah, I think particularly in the case of Star Wars 2, that was a film that even if you were watching it in the original language and you didn't speak English, there's enough visually that you can pick up what's going on with Star Wars. It's an easy enough film to kind of figure out the archetypes of what's going on, and it appeals to such a wide audience as it is.
Well, it's not even just Star Wars. I think they say that if you are making a film and if you can watch it without music and without any kind of audio and you understand it, that means you've done the job. Right. Yeah. So I think that's what Star Wars, and a lot of great films are like that. Like if you just watch it with the mute button turned on and you get it, that means that it has something. It has just a basic, like you said, very basic elements of storytelling.
Yes.
Yeah. Forbidden Planet you were talking about, I think they were talking about making Forbidden Planet in the early 2000s. I don't know if it was, I don't know if you read about this. There was a conversation, like when DreamWorks, I think it was a time when DreamWorks was in its fourth or fifth year, because they were talking about a lot of new projects, and it came up, but it never transpired into anything. Is that something that rings a bell, or am I mixing it up with something else?
This would have preceded that. I want to say this was the mid 90s when the Kirshner project was happening. Now it could have been, the lingering smoke of that fire,
Could be
getting rekindled, but I'm not sure if that was specifically that, or if that was a completely new attempt at relaunching it.
I wonder now, with so much like films like Avatar and a lot of nostalgia sort of taking place, I wonder if somebody would have that kind of ability to take that. And if that does happen, let's just say if some director wants to, remake Forbidden Planet from the 1956 version, do you think, do you see anybody approaching you guys for all the work that he did, or is it something that depends on the artist type of thing?
I would guess that if someone were going to try and mount that in a remaking of a classic, chances are they will be motivated enough or have a vision of their own that they're going to try and realize. Again, Ralph, we've published the book that has, the lion's share of Ralph's design work. Somebody could kind of see that and extrapolate.
That's true too.
But my guess would be, as we see with a lot of, remakes of classic films, people try and put such a new stamp on it so that it can stand on its own. That I would think in just the world today of what you can do, which, even, late 90s when Ralph was designing this, everything was still, the visual effects would not be at the, kind of level they can be today. Ralph watched as digital technology kind of swept in, and, was kind of amazed by the things they could do. It's funny, one thing, when The Phantom Menace came out, the Coruscant, the kind of galaxy, the center of the galaxy, the city planet, Ralph had done design work on that when he was working on Return of the Jedi. That was originally part of the story that didn't kind of got abandoned, but he had done quite a few paintings, and they went back and referenced a lot of those designs, and obviously they still do. Even The Mandalorian will watch a new episode, and it's like, there's a piece of Ralph that they pulled out of the archives. But the one thing he said when he saw Phantom Menace, and he'd met the crew, and he knew Doug Chang, and he was excited about what they were doing. But his one comment about Coruscant, he said, "Yeah," he's like, "they sure put a lot of traffic in the sky," and what's interesting is that's one of those things that is, I think, the curse of the technology, when it makes it easier to do things. When you're not having to fight for every little thing you get on screen, you can kind of go, it's easier to go overboard. And I think in Ralph's eye, it's like there was so much information on screen that his sensibility would have been to simplify it a bit, just, allow the majesty to take over the audience, but not have so much in every kind of corner of the screen because you could.
That's so true, though. I mean, it happens even nowadays, right? You look at, I'll give you an example. I'm sure you've seen the Matrix trilogy. I mean, in my view, even Star Wars, but I think Matrix particularly, because of the time it came out, if you watch the first Matrix now and you pay attention to it, it literally, other than those, cool action sequences, it doesn't really have any special effects that are, they kind of kept very limited frames. They didn't have like a super wide shot. But as soon as you watch the second and third one, and now the fourth one, it loses that premise of the story. That becomes a secondary thing. And everybody talks about this, right? That
Yeah.
how if the idea of having access to so much technology, and now I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of my questions was going to be about this AI thing now. Like I saw one of my colleagues on Facebook. I don't know which AI technology he used. He basically, told AI to create something like people in South Asian outfit, but in a futuristic setting. And it was mind blowing that what it did, and it looked so real. And do you feel that, I know that it probably won't, but do you feel there is with AI, not just in the work that you are working with Ralph's work and his legacy, it might obsolete the artwork when you can just tell AI technology just to do it in a matter of seconds, if not minutes?
Well, that there will always be opportunities for inexpensive solutions to problems, right?
Yeah.
So if you can get AI to meet your needs, people are going to use AI. They're going to say, it's cheaper for me to just go boom, boom, boom and get a result. What you're not going to ever get from AI is the heart of what Ralph McQuarrie was able to do, which is Ralph McQuarrie could read words on paper and come up with a vision. And not only a vision that looked good, because for Ralph, and I think this is something that, and I'll admit a bias because I spent so much time with Ralph, but this is something that I think separates Ralph from a lot of contemporary conceptual designers. When Ralph designed something, he brought to bear all of his experience, his industrial design experience, his world experience, his life experience. When Ralph created a spaceship, he could tell you the mechanics of it. And he would, in his mind, know how it worked. If he said, well, how do these ships kind of just float when they're, not yet flying, when they're on the temple and they got to take off.
Sure.
And Ralph would kind of work something out. And it was just for him. It was just his own edification of, I need to have something that I can do that allows me to do this design and justify why it is the way it is. As a perfect example, when Ralph designs a spaceship that is, a robot is going to sit in, there is space and a way in which that robot is going to sit in that spaceship. If you look at some of the designs for the prequel trilogy, they look really cool. But if you ask yourself, they've got a wedge spaceship that's got a droid that's taller than the spaceship, and his head is sticking out and the good news is most of the audience doesn't necessarily give it any attention.
Yeah.
But as soon as you start to think about those things, you think, oh yeah, that is kind of odd that, they're doing something because it looks cool. But if you want it to make more sense, you're going to pick it apart. You're going to pull threads. It's not going to withstand that sort of scrutiny. And with Ralph's work, the things always, when we first saw them, you'd see the spaceships, you'd see the sets, you'd see the designs, and they kind of, even though they were otherworldly, they're things we'd never seen before, you kind of got it. You kind of looked at it and said, yeah, that kind of makes sense. When they're walking around inside the ship, you're like, yeah, it kind of looks like, it means something. And that's, partially Ralph's work. It's partially the work of the people that then fabricate and build the sets. But it starts at that point of design where if the thought is going into it of, how would this work? I do think that informs it much further down the road. So that when something appears on screen, the audience's ability to accept that, as real, or, versus seeing it and thinking, gosh, that's a really cool special effect.
Yeah.
I think it's been a while, but seeing the last Avatar, there were times watching that movie when I thought, boy, where did they find all these blue people to make this movie? Because the world building and the intricacy of the design in the locations and in the look of the characters and things is such that as an audience member, you're able to just kind of forget that, this isn't people wearing makeup. This isn't, just something that was fabricated. This is somebody's vision, and they really thought through all the little details. Yeah. That is often missing when you see kind of sci-fi spectacle, big explosions and, Transformer things where, they turn into this, that, and the other. And you're like, how does something with this much mass suddenly have more mass or less mass? It's like,
the science behind it doesn't make much sense.
And again, whether it takes you out of the movie, even if it doesn't, I do think there's that your body absorbs that, your brain can kind of tell that, and when it has that extra thought that has gone into it, I do think it can make a difference in the audience experience of accepting that.
I agree with you 100%. My only concern now is that how would things be in the next 80, 70 years when the generation that's being, that's born into the world of social media and digital, how would they preserve all the stuff? And I was actually thinking about also that how, when we look back at our past, right? Majority of the stuff is very limited to photos, maybe if any, randomly, where you pose to get a family photo or stuff like that. But in about 70, 80 years, even this conversation is going to be on YouTube, provided the internet's still around, which I think will be. So there's just so much information overload. I don't know if that's going to be good for the society or not, but I hope that they appreciate the authenticity of work like Ralph's and other artists. Even like Picasso, like would it still be around? Who knows? I hope so, and I hope Ralph's work sticks around too. If it's okay, I didn't expect our conversation was going to go this quickly, which is great. I would love to do another part to this at another time, maybe more specifically to Ralph's particular amount of work. Maybe if we can go through some of his artwork, you and I can talk about it over the email and we can show it, because I think audience would be more susceptible to that too, to showing stuff while we're talking.
I can provide imagery and happy to do so to help support that. I can actually even give you some video clips of footage we shot with Ralph, talking about some of his specific experiences on Close Encounters and ET in particular. And the work he did with Steve, and he's got some interesting stories that I'm happy to share.
Sure, let's do that for another episode, because we basically talked about Ralph's work from a grand scale. Yeah. Let's focus on project. But this was great. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, not just as
the opportunity.
Yeah, no, as a moviegoer, but as a creative person, it's just phenomenal the amount of creativity there's out there in the world, and we always think we have seen enough, but and it's amazing. And thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Like I said, this is it's just one of the many ways that keeps Ralph alive for us. So days don't go by where we think about all he did. He's I'm surrounded by his artwork, but it's his spirit that that will always be the piece that I am so thankful to have experienced.
I bet. Well, I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up, John. Let's stay in touch. Would love to talk to you more about more films beyond ET and Close Encounters, because our podcast is now kind of wide open to cinema worldwide. So
excellent.
Would love to chat with you more. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Take care. Have a great evening.